when the war was everywhere, but nowhere. At the same time, they didn't call it a war you could see. There were no battlefields on American soil, no enemy uniforms marching through the streets. And yet, for millions of Americans, the Cold War was everywhere. It was in classrooms, living rooms, factories, and quiet suburban neighborhoods. It was in the air people breathed, in the way parents lowered their voices at night, in the drills children practiced at school, not fully understanding why they were being told to hide under desks as if a piece of wood could stop the end of the world. This wasn't paranoia. This was the reality of the era. A generation grew up knowing that somewhere across the ocean, another superpower existed with the ability to erase cities in minutes. And despite that knowledge, life went on. People woke up, went to work, raised families, built communities. That alone says something about America. Fear didn't stop the country. It hardened it. It was a strange balance during those years. On one side, fear was real. Nuclear sirens were tested. Fallout shelters were marked. Newsreels showed mushroom clouds rising into the sky like warnings from another world. On the other side, there was confidence, a belief that if the unthinkable ever happened, America would stand. Not because it wanted war, but because it refused to bend. That feeling settled deep into the culture. You could hear it in conversations, in jokes people made to cope, in the quiet certainty that whatever came next, this country would face it head-on. The Cold War wasn't just about missiles and politics, it was about endurance, about holding your ground without firing a shot. For many Americans, especially those who lived through it, this wasn't something learned from history books. It was lived. It was the constant awareness that freedom wasn't abstract. It was fragile, and it had to be protected, even in silence. And that awareness shaped a mindset that said, we don't collapse under pressure, we adapt. We don't panic, we prepare. That's why, decades later, people still talk about that time with a mix of tension and pride, because surviving the Cold War wasn't just about avoiding destruction, it was about proving something to the world, and maybe even to themselves, that this nation could stare down fear, live with it, and still move forward.
For American children growing up during the Cold War, fear didn't arrive through headlines or speeches. It arrived quietly in classrooms. Teachers didn't explain geopolitics or nuclear strategy. Instead, they gave instructions, simple ones, calm ones. When the alarm sounded, students were told to duck under their desks, cover their heads and wait. No panic, no screaming, just obedience and routine. To a child, it felt like a strange game. To adults, it was something else entirely. It was preparation for the unthinkable. And the fact that a nation taught its youngest generation how to respond, not how to run, speaks volumes about the mindset of the time. These drills became normal, so normal that many kids barely questioned them. The alarm would ring, chairs would scrape against the floor, and dozens of small bodies would disappear beneath wooden desks. Outside, the world looked the same. Inside, a quiet lesson was being taught. Danger exists, but you face it calmly. From the belief that even in the face of destruction, Americans would remain composed. This wasn't about pretending nothing could happen. It was about accepting reality and refusing to be ruled by fear. At home, the message continued in different ways. Parents talked about shelters, some stocked basements. Others trusted that the government, the military, and the system would hold. There was an unspoken confidence in American strength, not loud, not boastful, just present. People believed their country was prepared, that if things ever crossed the line, America wouldn't be caught helpless. And that belief mattered. It shaped how families slept at night, how communities functioned, how a generation learned to live with uncertainty without collapsing under it. Decades later, those children remember the feeling more than the details, the sound of the alarm, the smell of chalk and dust, the strange calm that followed. And many of them say the same thing. It didn't make them afraid for life. It made them resilient, because growing up in Cold War America meant learning early that strength wasn't the absence of fear. It was the ability to keep going anyway. That lesson, learned under school desks and reinforced by a nation standing firm, became part of what it meant to be American. Rumors, whispers, and the stories everyone believed. During the Cold War, not everything people feared came from official warnings or headlines. Much of it traveled quietly from mouth to mouth. Rumors spread in barbershops, factory floors, church gatherings, and family dinners. People talked about secret bases hidden in plain sight, about military convoys moving at night, about soldiers training for scenarios no one was supposed to ask about. You didn't need proof. The atmosphere alone made these stories feel possible. And when a nation lives under constant tension, possibility is often enough. Some believed American forces were always one step ahead, preparing for threats the public would never hear about until it was too late. Others whispered that certain cities were already marked, already calculated, already part of plans that existed somewhere deep inside military vaults. There were stories of drills that weren't on any schedule, of strange movements near airfields, of young men coming home quieter than before. No confirmations, no denials, just silence. And silence has a way of feeding imagination. But instead of panic, something else formed. A shared understanding that preparation was happening, whether people saw it or not. What made these rumors powerful wasn't fear alone. It was trust. Many Americans believed that if something had to be done, it was already being done. That soldiers were training in ways civilians couldn't understand. That strategies existed beyond public speeches. This belief didn't come from blind loyalty. It came from watching a country organize itself under pressure. Factories converting, technologies advancing, systems tightening. The rumors didn't weaken morale. They reinforced it. They created the sense that America wasn't reactive. It was ready. Years later, people still talk about those stories. Not to prove whether they were true or false, but because of how they felt at the time. The late-night conversations, the lowered voices, the certainty that something big was always unfolding just out of sight. And strangely, those memories aren't filled with helplessness. They're filled with resolve. Because believing that your country is prepared, even in the shadows, changes how you carry yourself. It turns fear into vigilance. And vigilance, for many Americans living through the Cold War, became second nature. That mindset didn't come from rumor alone. It came from a nation that taught its people, quietly and consistently, to stand firm even when the full picture was never revealed. The military, the machines, and the quiet confidence. For most Americans, the military during the Cold War wasn't something they saw every day. It existed at the edges of life, on the news, on the roads at night, in the background of national conversations. But its presence was felt. There was a sense that somewhere beyond public view, people were training constantly, not for glory, not for spectacle, but for scenarios no one wanted to imagine. Soldiers didn't talk much about what they did, and civilians didn't ask. That silence wasn't fear, it was respect. Technology played its role in shaping that confidence. Americans watched as jets grew faster, ships larger, systems more complex. They didn't need to understand every detail to feel the shift. The country was investing in readiness. Factories adapted. Engineers worked quietly. Bases expanded. And while headlines focused on diplomacy and tension, there was an underlying belief that if deterrence failed, America would not hesitate and would not be unprepared. This wasn't about domination. It was about balance, about making sure that no one ever doubted the cost of crossing a line. What mattered most wasn't the machines themselves, but what they represented. Discipline, coordination, purpose. Nation capable of organizing millions of people toward a single goal without collapsing into chaos. That idea settled deeply into the American mindset. Strength wasn't loud parades or constant threats. Strength was knowing you didn't need to prove anything. You prepared, you waited, and you held your position. That confidence didn't erase fear, it contained it. Looking back, many remember that feeling more than any specific weapon or uniform. The quiet trust that the system worked, that people were in place, doing their jobs, even when the public couldn't see it. It created a sense of stability in an unstable world. And for those who lived through it, that stability became part of their identity. It wasn't about loving war. It was about believing in the resilience of a country that understood the weight of power and carried it carefully. The Cold War didn't stop life in America. That might be its most defining feature. People still fell in love, built careers, raised children, and planned for the future, even with the constant awareness that everything could change in an instant. Fear didn't disappear. It simply took a seat in the background, and Americans learned how to live with it without surrendering to it. That wasn't denial. It was resilience. Neighborhoods stayed active. Schools held events. Families gathered around dinner tables. Sometimes talking about politics, sometimes avoiding it altogether. There was an unspoken agreement that life had to go on. Not because danger wasn't real, but because giving into it would mean losing something far more important. This attitude became part of the culture. Strength wasn't measured by the absence of fear, but by the refusal to let fear dictate everyday life. For many, this period created habits that lasted a lifetime. Preparedness without obsession. Awareness without panic. A sense that responsibility extended beyond oneself, to family, to community, to country. People trusted systems, routines, and each other. That trust wasn't naive. It was earned through consistency, through decades of holding steady under pressure. And in that steadiness, a quiet pride formed. Not the kind that needs applause, but the kind that stays with you. When people look back now, they often describe the era as tense, but also strangely grounding. It demanded maturity. It demanded patience. It demanded belief, not just in institutions, but in the idea that a society could endure prolonged uncertainty without fracturing. That belief shaped how Americans saw themselves. They weren't spectators to history. They were participants in endurance. And that, more than any headline or policy, defined what it felt like to live through the Cold War in America. The legacy that still lives today. Today, the Cold War is often reduced to dates, speeches, and old footage. But for those who lived through it, it was never just history. It was a way of thinking, a way of carrying yourself in a world that felt uncertain but demanded composure. That mindset didn't vanish when the tension eased. It stayed. It influenced how generations approached crisis, responsibility, and national identity. The Cold War taught Americans that strength isn't always visible. Sometimes it's measured by restraint, preparation, and patience. Many of the systems built during that era still exist. So do the habits. The instinct to prepare before reacting. The belief that freedom isn't guaranteed but maintained. And while the world has changed, that underlying lesson remains. Living through the Cold War meant understanding that power comes with weight, and that carrying it responsibly matters just as much as possessing it. That understanding shaped how America saw itself, not as a nation seeking conflict, but as one prepared to endure it if necessary. For those who remember, this period doesn't inspire fear anymore. It inspires reflection, a recognition that surviving decades of tension without collapse required something rare: collective discipline. And that discipline wasn't imposed. It was learned quietly over time. It lived in everyday choices, in routines, in trust, and in the belief that some things are worth standing firm for, even when the cost is uncertainty. This is why the Cold War still matters. Not because of the weapons or the politics, but because of the people who lived through it and carried on. They proved that a nation doesn't need constant victory to define itself. Sometimes simply holding steady is enough. And for many Americans, that endurance became part of who they are. A reminder that strength can be calm, confidence can be silent, and history isn't only written on battlefields, but in the lives of those who refuse to let fear decide their future.